IJN Shinano. She was the largest aircraft carrier of her time, and also technically the third sister of the Yamato-class battleship family. Wait, what? Shinano, named after the Shinano province to go along with the rest of her sisters, who were named after the Yamato and Musashi provinces, was again the third member of the Yamato family, but quite obviously, not a battleship. How did this happen? Well, Shinano was one of two additional members of the Yamato family that were ordered as part of the 4th Naval Armament Supplement Program of 1939. Laid down on May 4th, 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, she was to be the third member of the family of the heaviest battleships ever constructed, but she was never completed as a battleship. Originally, her specifications were similar to her elder sisters, though slightly different, mostly in terms of her armor. She was designed with less armor than Musashi and Yamato, because it was found that, frankly, they had way more than they needed to, at least to do what they wanted it to do. So in order to save on resources, Shinano's armor was going to be up to an inch thinner in certain spots. She was also supposed to have brand new anti-aircraft guns. The 65 cal Type 98 dual-purpose guns were supposed to be installed on her because they were better than the 40 cal Type 89 guns that both Yamato and Musashi had been equipped with. But again, Shinano never became a battleship because Japan was starting to think maybe they didn't need another battleship. This was first entertained actually before Midway. Some sources say it was after Midway, but even Japan was starting to think this might be the case prior to that point, because they themselves had had some pretty big successes using aircraft in naval warfare. They had been responsible for sinking 2 British capital ships with their own bombers, Prince of Wales and Repulse. And it got to thinking, these battleships are cool and all, but maybe they're not really the future of warfare. Maybe that's not what we should be focusing on. And it's certainly a relevant thought with Shinano because, yes, the Yamato classes were big and impressive and cool. Also, they were very expensive to build, and they had to consider what's going to be more useful. Construction of her hull was temporarily suspended in December of 1941, while they figured things out. They had just gotten us into the war, so they needed to spend resources logically if they wanted to, win. They wouldn't, but, that was the thought. But they couldn't really decide what to do with her, whether they were going to finish her or not. They also wanted to make the dry dock she was in available for other uses, but in order to do that, that meant they either had to scrap her entirely or finish her enough to launch her. And in the end, they opted on the latter choice, but with a reduced workforce. Much like her elder sisters, her existence was a closely guarded secret, even during construction, and in fact, she is the only major warship built in the 20th century that was never officially photographed during her construction at all. Just to be clear, this video is going to have a lot of repeated imagery because there's only 3 pictures of her known to exist. That's how mysterious she was. And 2 of those pictures are aerial shots, once by the Japanese, and the other time was actually by us from a B-29, who was just seeing what they were up to. By June of 1942, she was only 45% complete, but after the Battle of Midway is when they finally decided on what they were going to do with her, because they had lost 4 carriers. Not only did this make it abundantly clear to what they were already thinking that, aircraft are going to be very effective during this conflict, but also, wow, we just lost 4 of the carriers we need to do that ourselves. That's neat. They needed another carrier, now. And Shinano was certainly large enough to be converted into a carrier, though there was a problem. See, she was only 45% complete, and that's true, but she was complete enough where turning her into a fleet carrier was actually going to be a bit of a pain in the butt. Her design didn't really allow for this, but what they could get away with was turning her into a heavily armored support carrier, meant to carry reserve aircraft and fuel and ordnance in support of the actual fleet carriers. This decision makes her incredibly unique in that way too, because support carriers are usually smaller than fleet carriers. Shinano wasn't smaller than any carriers because she was a Yamato-class, but the work they had already done limited them, and it would take longer to completely rework her, so they were like, the heck with it, just make her so she could carry some aircraft. And work quickly began to accomplish this task. In the end, she had a length of 265.8 meters, 872 feet 1 inches, a beam of 36.3 meters, 119 feet 1 inch, and a draft of 10.3 meters, 33 feet 10 inches. She displays 65,800 tons. And as I mentioned, when she was done, she was the heaviest aircraft carrier that had been built up until that point. She would hold that record until the USS Forrestal was launched by us in 1954. She was designed to have a crew of 2,400 officers and enlisted men. And internally, at least in terms of her engines, she was identical to her sisters. She had literally the same inner workings. The 4-geared steam turbines, the 150,000 shaft horsepower, 12 Campton water tube boilers. She had everything that her sisters did when it came to her power plant, with a design speed of 27 knots, 31 miles per hour. Though it is worth mentioning she would never be able to conduct proper full-speed trials, so it's not known whether she actually met that design parameter, but that's what they expected to get out of her. Due to her being an awkward transition in the middle of building a battleship, her traits are a little odd when it came to the flight deck and the hangar and everything going into the aircraft carrier part of her. But some of the decisions were based on experiences that Japan had had during the war, and they wanted to not make these same mistakes again. She was designed to load and fuel all her aircraft on deck, not internally. Earlier Japanese carriers did the fuel and arming below the decks, but that made the carriers extremely vulnerable to attack. Shinano did not do this. Additionally, most of her hangar was actually left open for better ventilation. The intent behind that was twofold. For one thing, the open sides would allow things like burning ordnance and aircraft to simply be tossed out before they could actually damage the ship. And for two, experience with Taiho had showed them the importance of ventilation, and on top of the open sides, she also had a much larger ventilation system to expel noxious fumes that would be combustible and possibly, explode. Though similarly to Taiho, not only was her island modeled after hers, but Shinano was given an armored deck to resist hits from, say, dive bombers. She did have unarmored sides on her hangars, and due to stability concerns, she technically only had one hangar, a large one, but only one. The forward area of that hangar was dedicated to maintenance and storage facilities, and aircraft were transported between it and the flight deck by 2 different elevators, one at each end of the hangar on the center line. She was intended to carry Japan's more advanced planes, but basically none of those would ever be available. And in fact, I'm not sure she ever got the chance to carry any actual planes at all because of what would wind up happening to her, but we're going to get to that in a moment. She did also have her own defenses beyond her aircraft. Her primary armament consisted of 16 40 cal Type 89 dual-purpose guns and 8 twin mounts. She was able to fire at surface targets with these, if she had to, and she also had 105 Type 96 light anti-aircraft guns and 35 triple gun mounts. It's worth mentioning the Type 96, while it was the Japanese standard, was actually kind of a piece of crap, at least when compared to other anti-aircraft weapons that were available to anyone not Japan. But to complement the Type 89 guns, she did have 4 Type 94 high-angle fire control directors too, and she's believed to have had Type 22 and Type 13 air search radars. Or if she didn't when she sank, they were planning on giving them to her at some point. Because of her conversion, her armor got a little wonky in some places. Her original waterline belt armor thickness was gonna be 15.7 inches, but when they started the conversion, it was retained only where they'd already actually installed it. Outside of that spot, they reduced it significantly everywhere else to just 6.3 inches. And below it was a strake of armor that was tapered in its thickness, from 200 millimeters to just 75 millimeters at the bottom edge. She did have large external anti-torpedo bulges, and they were backed up by an armored bulkhead that extended down from the belt armor. The bulkhead was intended to prevent splinters from piercing the main hull, but it wasn't watertight. It was just backed up by a second one, which was watertight. The thing is, the joint that was located between the upper and lower armor belts was actually pretty weak. It was a design issue that was shared with her elder sisters, and it could be called her entire family's Achilles heel. In her case, it would be her undoing. But one smart choice they made was due to the loss of Taiho and the reasons behind it. They opted to fill the empty spaces around Shinano's aviation fuel tanks with concrete, just in case they broke, and that would prevent any fumes from escaping. So that was a smart decision. They were like, we are not letting her go off like a bomb. But between design issues, some smart decisions, some questionable decisions, some oversights, Shinano's real problem was not only did she show up extremely late to the conflict when Japan was almost certainly going to lose, and by almost I mean definitely certainly going to lose, but when she was completed, quote unquote, she was not actually completed. Originally, she was scheduled to be done by April of 1945, but as Japan got pushed back further, they moved up the expected completion date and put a lot of pressure on the workers to get her finished. There weren't enough workers to make this happen, so they just kind of yelled at the ones that were working on her, and that led to a lot of poor workmanship, because they were literally being rushed. She was finally actually launched on October 8th, 1944. They had never managed to launch her prior to that point, with Captain Toshio Abe in command. But it didn't actually go smoothly. One of the caissons at the end of the dock had not been properly ballasted with seawater, and that lifted as water rose to the level of the harbor. The sudden inrush of water into the graving dock pushed Shinano to the forward end, and that damaged her bow structure below the waterline, which meant she had to be repaired as soon as she was launched. Those repairs weren't done till October 26. But she would start being fitted out and performing some sea trials after that point, and she was formally commissioned at Yokosuka on November 19th, 1944. On that exact date is when the B-29 bomber took a photo of the area. And Shinano is in it. She's right there. Not only did this give us one more image of her, but it actually spooked the Japanese. They did not want to lose another carrier. She was like one of their only ones left. So the Navy General Staff ordered that she depart for Kure by November 28th. Her fitting out process wasn't actually completed, and they decided to do it all there. But Captain Abe was not really thrilled about these orders. He was her captain, and he'd already inspected her, and he knew better than most that, she is so not ready to sail. The majority of her watertight doors weren't even installed yet. They hadn't done compartment air tests, and there were still a lot of extra holes in the bulkheads for electrical cables and pipes, which had yet to be sealed. She also didn't have her fire mains and bailing systems. Well, she did, but they lacked pumps and were effectively useless. They had given the crew the portable pumps, but they had never been trained on those properly. Abe did place in a request for a delay in the date of departure to try to get some of this stuff done, but the request was denied, and thus Shinano was forced to depart as scheduled with a small destroyer escort at 1800 on November 28th. Underneath Captain Abe was a crew of 2,175 officers and enlisted men, and also 300 shipyard workers and 40 civilian employees. Yeah, they took civvies with them, because they were still trying to get a lot of the work done, and that's alarming. And since they were trying to get some of this work done on the trip, the few watertight doors that were installed were actually left open for ease of access into her machinery spaces. Abe had originally wanted a daylight passage, because one of the other concerns he had was that the destroyers that were coming with them had crews that had just gotten back from getting utterly annihilated at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and they were exhausted. Abe recognized this and wanted the destroyer crews to have time to rest. If it was during the day, they could chill out a bit, since it was only at night that they were all on high alert. The daylight passage would also allow him to train his crew, getting them prepared in the event of an attack. Abe wasn't stupid, he was trying his best here, but Japan didn't have any planes left at all, which is great because this is a carrier. she needs planes, but they didn't have, like, any planes. And as a result, the Navy General Staff couldn't give him any air cover, and without air cover, a daytime passage was just way too risky, so he was forced to run at night instead. On board were not actually any planes whatsoever, at least not proper ones. To begin with, she had 6 Shinyo suicide boats. These were boats that were used in suicide attacks, plowing into the enemy and just blowing up. Additionally, she had 50 Oka suicide flying bombs, human-guided kamikaze attack aircraft. But understand, Okas didn't usually take off from the ground. They were rocket-powered, and I guess you could rig them up to take off from the ground, but they were meant to be dropped out of bombers as parasite craft and flown that way, and then into the side of a ship and killing the pilot. It's the whole Imperial Japan thing. But the point is, Shinano didn't actually have any aircraft she could use for anything. Her actual complement of aircraft weren't planned to be put on her until later. It would require them to have planes. They didn't have many left, but that was the intent. The reason she had the kamikaze craft is that she was supposed to deliver them to the Philippines and Okinawa after she was done with her fitting out process in Kure. She would need 16 hours to make the trip at her average speed of 20 knots, that's 23 miles per hour. And though Abe was probably not in an amazing mood, given he knew they were in a very, very dangerous situation with a ship that was so not ready to be out there, he was promised a promotion to Rear Admiral once fitting out was complete, so that was a nice thought. But just under 3 hours into her voyage, she and her escorts were spotted by an American submarine, Archerfish, under the command of Commander Joseph F. Enright. Archerfish had detected Shinano and her escorts on radar and opted to follow them on a parallel course. But this wasn't actually as stealthy as they thought. See, an hour and a half prior to that point, Shinano had detected the radar from the sub. They knew one was out there. But understand that under normal circumstances, Shinano should have been able to easily outrun Archerfish. Shinano was faster than the submarine, but Shinano was zigzagging. That was in an effort to avoid torpedoes, ironically enough. But due to the nature of her zigzagging and the exact directions involved, it wound up turning her and her escorts into Archerfish's path several different times, allowing the sub to continue pursuit. Shinano's lookouts would spy Archerfish on the surface at 22:45, and against orders, the destroyer Izukaze broke formation to go after her. Abe would sternly order Izukaze to come back into formation because he thought that Archerfish was actually part of a wolf pack, that they were being used as a decoy to try to break up the defenses so the rest of the subs that were underneath the surface could attack them. It wasn't a tactic that hadn't been seen before, though Archerfish was alone. It really was just her. Still, with the information he had, it wasn't an unreasonable suspicion, and he also knew that they could outrun the sub. So he ordered all the ships to turn away from Archerfish and simply run. Just don't deal with it. They can't catch up to them, or at least they shouldn't have been able to. But Shinano ran into a problem. One of her bearings started overheating, and that could have damaged the propeller shaft if they didn't reduce speed down to just 18 knots, 21 miles per hour. That was the same speed as Archerfish, and Shinano was still zigzagging. At 2:56 on November 29th, Shinano would make a turn to the southwest. That put her straight towards Archerfish's position. Just 8 minutes later, Archerfish herself would turn to the east, and then submerged in preparation to actually make an attack. Shinano then turned south, unknowingly exposing her entire side directly to Archerfish. Which is like a shot that submariners have dreams of.
Oh. Thank you, God. You are on the wall.
If things couldn't get bad enough, one of the destroyer escorts actually wound up passing over Archerfish directly without detecting her. At 3:15, Archerfish would fire a spread of 6 torpedoes, aiming for Shinano, then diving immediately to 400 feet to escape a possible depth charge attack from the escorts, who would likely be pretty mad about the whole thing. Commander Enright had made a decision to set the torpedoes to run shallow at only 10 feet, and there were two reasons for this decision. For one thing, the torpedoes he was using had a habit of running deeper than they were set, and he didn't want to risk them running underneath their target. For two, by hitting Shinano higher up, he hoped to increase the chances of her capsizing. And the attack was an alarming success. Out of the 6 torpedoes fired, 4 would hit at an average depth of 14 feet. See, they did run a little bit deeper. He was right. The first one struck towards the stern, the second hit the compartment where the starboard outboard propeller shaft entered the hull and flooded the outboard engine room. The third hit forward, flooding the number 3 boiler room and killing all the men that were there. And there were further structural failures, which flooded the 2 adjacent boiler rooms as well, and the fourth flooded the starboard air compressor room, right next to the AA gun magazines. Oh, and the number 2 damage control station, which probably would have been really nice to not have destroyed. The damage was pretty bad, but at first, Abe thought that they could handle it. Shinano was a big ship, and yeah, she was hit by 4 torpedoes, but in theory, they probably could have managed it. And to be fair, if she had been finished properly and actually ready to sail, she probably could have managed it. But she wasn't. Both Abe and his crew were pretty confident in themselves early on. They felt that Shinano was tough, well-armored, very strong, Imperial Japan. But unfortunately, this confidence did not translate into, taking the situation seriously. They were pretty lax at first when it came to their damage control efforts. In terms of Abe, even after the 4th torpedo hit, he still ordered that Shinano maintain speed, which pushed more water through the holes in the hull, causing even more flooding. Within just a few minutes, she was listing 10 degrees to starboard. In order to correct the list, the crew would pump 3,000 tons of water into the port bilges, but that didn't actually stop it. Water was coming in too fast on the starboard side. The list would increase to 13 degrees, and this made it clear to Abe that actually this is worse than he thought. Okay, alright. So he opted to change course towards Shiono Point, which is the southernmost tip of Honshu's Key Peninsula. He wanted to get somewhere, not in the middle of the ocean. But the list continued to get worse. It was up to 15 degrees by 3:30. 15 minutes after this, Abe ordered that the empty port outboard tanks be counter-flooded, which did finally reduce the list to 12 degrees, but not for very long. After 5 o'clock, he would order civilian workers to be transferred to the escort destroyers because not only were they kind of in the way, but also they were just civilians. By 5:30 in the morning, Shinano was making only 10 knots with a list of 13 degrees. And from here, she would deteriorate very, very quickly. By 6 o'clock, the list was up to 20 degrees. And that was as a result of the starboard boiler room finally flooding. That meant that the valves of the port trimming tanks rose above the waterline and didn't actually do anything anymore. And her engines would finally shut down completely at 7 o'clock. Unable to do anything about that, Abe ordered all of the propulsion compartments evacuated at 8 o'clock. Then he made an order for the 3 outboard port boiler rooms to be flooded to try to reduce the list again, while at the same time, he ordered Hamikaze and Isokaze, 2 of the destroyer escorts, to actually take Shinano in tow since she had no power. But this was not something that was going to work. They tried, but Shinano was big. Really big. These destroyers were not at all big. They weren't strong enough to pull Shinano in this way. The first time they tried, the tow cable snapped under the strain, and the second attempt was aborted before that could happen a second time because that's liable to take somebody's friggin' head off. Shinano would finally lose all power at 9 o'clock and was now listing over 20 degrees. Abe himself would never actually issue a formal order to abandon ship. What he did, though, was at 10:18, he released all the crew of their duties, which is basically another way of saying, I'm not going to tell you to abandon the ship. But you can! Shinano's list would increase to at least 30 degrees, and as she continued to roll over, water flowed into the open elevator well on her flight deck, which had a suction effect, dragging some of her crew back inside her as she went down. At 10:57, she finally capsized, sinking stern first. 65 miles from land, and around 13,000 feet of water. 1,435 officers, men, and civilians died, while 1,080 did manage to survive. Among the dead was Abe himself, who chose to go down with Shinano, and both of his navigators opted to stay with him. And thus was the sad end of Japan's largest aircraft carrier that never had a chance to do literally anything, because she just wasn't finished. Interestingly, on our side, U.S. Naval Intelligence didn't believe Enright when he said they'd sunk the carrier. They said, no, you didn't. There's no... What? This is because Shinano's construction had never been detected by us through decoded radio messages, or by any other methods. At the time, our analysts thought that we had actually located every single carrier that Japan still had. We didn't actually accept that Shinano was a thing, even though one of the captured aviators from Japan had confessed in July of 1943 that the third Yamato-class battleship was being turned into one. They thought he had sunk a ship, so eventually they were credited with sinking a 28,000-ton Hayatake Hiyo-class carrier by the acting commander of the Pacific Fleet's submarine force on the basis of a drawing Enright submitted of the ship he claimed to have attacked. It was only after the war that we finally realized, oh, Shinano was a thing. Oh, Enright! Oh, man, we are so sorry about all this. And he, his crew, and Archerfish were officially credited with the sinking, and he was awarded the Navy Cross, so that was nice. On a related note, she remains the largest ship ever sunk by a submarine. While Enright and his crew could be credited with their good aim, hitting her with 4 torpedoes, the truth was, Shinano was taken down by her own design problems, and the fact that she simply wasn't done. That Achilles heel I mentioned, yeah, all 4 torpedoes exploded directly on that joint, so they hit her right in her weak spot. And she was also crippled by the fact that they had never tested for water tightness. Shinano's XO did survive the sinking, and he would go on to blame the large amount of seawater that entered the ship on the failure to air test the compartments for leaks. He personally heard air rushing through gaps in the watertight doors just minutes after the last torpedo hit, which not only was an obvious sign that seawater was entering the ship, but also meant these doors were not going to hold up to the seawater. So really, Shinano had no chance, because she was thrown out there in a fit of desperation. Just one more carrier. They've got Enterprise and she's fighting the war by herself. We could do that too. Yeah, that's great. For one thing, Enterprise still has planes, and for 2, Enterprise was actually finished. Hello? Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.